Hello again, Podcast Village, and welcome back to another episode of Colorblind, Race Across Generations.
Hey, you got it.
I was about to introduce myself. Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm your host, Vanessa Eccles, along with producer Keith, who just chimed right in. How you doing?
That was me. Yep, I apologize. I'm sorry.
How are you?
I'm good.
So this episode, boy, we have some great guests. We've had great guests for every episode.
Yep.
So today we have Marucci Guzman, who is the Executive Director of Latino Leadership. And from the Peace and Justice Institute at Valencia College in Orlando, we have Rudy Darden and Rachel Allen. We were talking about some very interesting subjects today. This is called Colorblind, Race Across Generations, and we're talking about race. So today we're talking about how to talk about race. Imagine that. I'm not sure why it's taken me 3 episodes to do that, but we're talking about that. We're also talking about what happened with Starbucks and the men who were arrested for sitting in the Starbucks. We're talking about the fraternity at Syracuse University. That fraternity has been expelled because of the racist video that came to light. Racist, sexist, homophobic. There was just a whole bunch of bad stuff on that video. And then, of course, we close with, when it comes to race, I admit. So it was a very interesting conversation with them today.
Absolutely.
Is that all you have to say?
Hey,
I thought you looked like you were going to say something
yeah,
else.
That's sorry. Sometimes I'm profound. Sometimes, it was good.
So we got started with just how do you talk about race in a business setting, in a social setting, if you're at a conference. But the main thing is just how to start the conversation. And that really is at the heart of the podcast, what we're trying to do. So let's listen in. We're taking a deep dive this week into how to talk about race with Colorblind, Race Across Generations.
Yay.
Well, hello again, Podcast Village, and thank you to my guests for joining me here today, Marucci, Rachel, Rudy. The 2 R's, Rachel and Rudy. So, first topic, we're going to talk about how to talk about race. I think it was our first podcast, we talked about why people are afraid to talk about race. So it occurred to me, well then, if you're not afraid, how do we talk about it? So, coming from the place of the Peace and Justice Institute, this is part of your mission. So how do we get that conversation started? Rachel, you want to jump in first. How do we talk about race?
Well, one of the things that we do when we introduce conversations about race is we establish some guiding principles to support that conversation. And we call them our principles for how we treat each other. And we read them at the beginning of every event. And so they remind us to suspend judgment, slow down, check our assumptions, turn to wonder. So they're just some basic principles that that also, I think, invite us to tell the truth, because I think that is the scariest thing. So the principle that says speak your truth is so critical in these conversations around race, and it's really probably one of the hardest things to do, is be honest.
And so, Rudy, from the standpoint of the Peace and Justice Institute, all of those things Rachel mentioned, so what does that mean? If I'm in a setting, and the subject of race comes up or an issue comes up that deals with race, how do you just jump in there knowing that, okay, I'm going to talk about race and now everybody's going to leave the room because it makes us uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think first, even before jumping into the room, there's an acknowledgement that the Peace and Justice facilitators, we understand who we are and the stories that we represent. So as a Black male, I understand that when I start talking about race, that's viewed differently than Rachel, who's a white woman, who will begin to initiate a conversation about race. And so what we're really mindful of is to acknowledge that whenever we're going to have a conversation about race or any system of oppression, what we make sure that we do is make sure we have people represented in the space that can give the listeners, the audience, an opportunity to get a vantage point that they can connect with. So it's first being honest with ourselves and the stories that we know we want to share. And then when we get into a space, we feed off of each other's stories. We know each other very well. We not just do the principles as a way of guiding a conversation on race. it's become a lifestyle. It's become what we do when we're in our homes. And so I think when you have the principles of how we treat each other as a foundation, I think then when we go into a space and a topic like race comes up, or we have initiated the conversation on race, we can look at each other and we can say which story reflects the kind of evidence from the audience that's represented in the room. Let's make sure that person's story when it comes to serial testimony is the one that we use. But also there's just this kind of flow that happens when you understand that these principles are something that we're going to be guiding by, especially the one principle that says simply respect the silence. A lot of times when people bring up something that's sensitive or something that is a hot button topic, there's this need to try to fill the space and respond. Mm-hmm. Well, I've noticed directly that, especially in doing this work, that one of the best things to do is just simply hold that space and then the process. And to turn to wonder, why am I feeling this way? What would the best response be if there's a response needed at all? So back to Rachel's point, it's just a matter of making sure that we stay true to what those principles are and understand who we are.
But if we're not in a setting where we've come together for some kind of conference to talk about race, if we are just in a social setting or if we're in the workplace, how do we talk about race in a social setting? Marucci?
You know, it's funny. So before arriving today, I took my daughter to a tutoring session, and her tutor is a high school girl in a local high school, and she is half Puerto Rican, half black. But when you talk to her, it was interesting to listen to her vantage point, because her vantage point was very much black. And she was referring to Puerto Rican issues, because I'm Puerto Rican, and she was referring to me. And then when we were talking about the black community, she was talking about her family. And I told her I was coming, and I was reading through some of the questions, because I kind of wanted to get that from her. You know, when you're in the nonprofit sector, if you're working, you're in different social environments, and, you know, they tell you not to talk about religion and you don't talk about politics. And in today's world, you don't talk about race because you don't know when you're going to set somebody off. But when you're an opinionated person, I guess you kind of forget those things. And it
like
just,
you are, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So, like, I'm sure my husband wishes I was quiet sometimes, but you know, when you hear injustice, you can't help but react. When you hear a comment that is just wrong, you can't help but react. But I think, to your point, it's just in the matter of how you do that. And one of the things I was asking her was, in her perspective, how she felt if someone that wasn't black was pointing an issue out to her or brought up a conversation. So it's kind of, you know, just an interesting to kind of hear her responses to that and her opinion, because she's young, you know, and just talking to it, it's very difficult because it's not a subject that people are okay with. Because at the end of the day, and something that she said was, I think everybody has a little bit of racism in them, or whether it's discrimination, there's somebody that, you know, just for whatever reason you have a feeling towards. And she said until people realize that and accept that, she's like, nothing's going to change, because we go through life and we all say, oh, that's not me. But we all have it. You know, if you're truly honest with yourself and you truly look at yourself, we all have some type of judgment about something. And one of the things that we brought up was Obama in 2008, that at the same time California ushered in this proposition against the gay community and gay marriage. And we were kind of just going through that dynamic, and she's like, you know, I didn't think about that. So at a time that we had this amazing rush of something new for a community and a sense of pride, there was another community that was now ostracized, and they felt the negativity of that. So it's just kind of, you know, to hear a 16-year-old's perspective on that was really interesting.
So if we're in a social setting and someone says something that we perceive as just downright racist, what do we do? How do you approach that? Because I think there are two approaches. You can fly off the handle and say you're a racist rant and, you know, you're a terrible person.
Yeah.
Sometimes people choose not to say anything because it's like, oh, I don't want to say anything because then I'll start this whole, you know, uncomfortable racial conversation. Where's the middle ground? How do we start that conversation?
Well, I think for me, I mean, the most important thing is to try to be authentic and to bring up a conversation around race. And people will say to me, you know, Rachel, people sense your genuineness, because I am genuinely interested in knowing, you know, you. And so even though it's awkward, I think when people sense that there is an attempt to build a relationship and get to know you, you know, they want to talk. And if something racist is said, I mean, it's that same thing. It's to take the risk to say, that really bothers me. It's uncomfortable to hear you say that. I wonder what you mean. And I find myself defaulting to those principles because one of them is to ask an open, honest question. And even sometimes people say things, sometimes people are blatantly racist, and sometimes people don't know what they're saying. So the open question could be, did you realize what that means or what you said? Because a lot of times people don't know. Now, sometimes when you say they're blatantly racist, gosh, I mean, I think it's to consider whether there's going to be a listening ear there and to try to find some angle to come in, to be heard. Because I think for me, there are situations where I'm not sure there's an open ear, but I think that there are other ways maybe to reach that person. So I feel like I have to be very strategic sometimes. Listen, turn to wonder. I wonder why this person feels this way, thinks this way, and then find an angle to go in and maybe turn the conversation in a different direction.
And isn't listening a great part of it, though? Because sometimes you mentioned that sometimes people just don't know. Maybe before we fly off the handle and want to punch them, we need to ask. Because, for a while that was I'm like, okay, as soon as no one's looking, I'm going to punch you in the, face. Maybe we should listen and then ask, why do you think that way?
I think one of the strange dynamics now of talking about race is that Dr. Beverly Tatum says this too in her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She came to Valencia just a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about—
I was there.
Yes. And she talked about the ways in which we can respond to people, especially if there's some sort of connection that we have. So if there's an affinity, if a black man is saying something that is homophobic, there's a certain kind of a affinity that black man has with me because we may share a similar reality in terms of how people respond to black men. So if I hear a homophobic comment, because we have that affinity as two black men, there's the 3 F's rule. There's the I felt, I found, and I feel. So this is just a real practical strategy on if we hear something that is uncomfortable. There's to Marucci, did I say that correctly? Marucci's point was that, and your point, Rachel, has to be some kind of angle and connection that we have with that person, because once we can find out that there is an angle or connection, we can come in with, hey, I kind of felt this way before, or maybe there was something similar because like there's a judgment that I have towards certain groups. And so because I have this judgment towards certain group in the same way that I hear you having a judgment towards this, I felt this way before. And then but here's what I found with having now entered into relationships with people who are like that. And then you give your true story of what you found. And then after that, there's here's what I feel now that I've had that relationship. So just remembering the 3 F's rule as a real practical way of responding in that moment. But that's saying that we actually, to Rachel's point, have been strategic enough to know that this person might have an open ear. But what if this person doesn't? We know
Exactly.
that there's a chemical response in our brain that says fight, flight, or freeze. And it's just about making sure that there are certain things that I know as a black man people don't say around me. I mean, it just doesn't happen. I more often find myself responding to things that I'm not a part of. Maybe places where I wasn't, where somebody said something and then I end up confronting, or I hear myself responding not to issues on race, but more towards other types of systems of oppression that end up mirroring a racial conversation that I've had.
A friend of mine said, she said, you should do a podcast segment on friends don't let friends say racist things. And first I kind of chuckled, and I'm like, why do you say that? And she said that she was in a social environment, and a friend of hers said something that she found racially offensive. And so she said she stopped to see if anyone else, what reaction. And she said there was some, uncomfortable kind of chuckle, some uncomfortable silence. But they didn't engage in conversation. And so she said she struggled with that. Should we engage in a conversation there? And then she said, first of all, I don't want to lose the person's friendship. And second of all, I didn't want to bring down the party by getting into a heavy subject. So what do you do?
But that reminds me, in one of the articles that you sent with the questions for today, just kind of going through it, one of the quotes from the university was apathy is complicity. So if at what point is staying quiet you being a part of the problem? Because if we don't ever address the problem because we don't want to be the Debbie Downer, because we don't want, the party to kind of end at that point.
Party's over. We're talking about race now.
Right. But if we continue to let it happen, how much of a friend are they if they don't share that same mind friend as you? Like, there's some things for me that are non-negotiable, right? That's one. That's something that, if I'm at a party and someone's saying something, you're going to address it, come what comes of it. But I think as you kind of see things going on in our community and you see issues and you see opportunities that come up for you to address issues, if we just continue to stay quiet, nothing's ever going to change, because it just becomes a status quo. It becomes normal operating procedure, and then it's okay, and when it's really not.
So we have to be bold, but we also have to have an open heart and listen.
Sure.
Rather than just immediately start yelling and screaming. Rachel, were you going to...
Well, because my goal always is to create real and authentic change. And I think we have to be very strategic, because people do get very defensive, because I think most of us really want to be doing the right thing. And so when a mistake is made, it's, how do we point that out to people so they can hear it and stay open to it and make a change? And I'm going to give you an example without all the details, because I want to kind of protect some people's, privacy in it. But I'm involved in an institution that had an ongoing tradition, had been going on for many years, and it involved my children, and I was witness to it and found it to be quite offensive, very offensive. And when I found out about it, we were too far in the process to do, that whole Debbie Downer thing. I mean, I would have been the mom who is the Debbie Downer. And it's such a burden, right?
The unfun mom.
Yeah. And yet at the same time, it was not something that I could let go, because it's so damaging to my children, to the children of other parents. And maybe some of the parents aren't even aware, because we have this saying, DK, we don't know what we don't know. A lot of parents weren't conscious. But I did deal with it after the fact, in a situation where people could hear. And I was very nervous to be that mom, because I feel like a lot of times I am that mom, because when you wake up to this, it's everywhere, right? But I was so pleased to feel heard, and to be, after moments of defensiveness, to then be told, we're going to address this. And then about a week later, get a phone call, or it might have even been 2 days later, that said, we're making the change. And I felt so happy that I took the risk, because again, who wants to be that mom that's constantly, and as Rudy knows, I mean, we all know it's everywhere, right? We all know. But then to feel heard and valued, and then to feel that feeling of, gosh, that really wasn't that hard. You know what I mean? Speaking up, taking that risk, having that meeting, and look at the power of my voice. And then recognizing that so much change can happen if each one of us just uses that voice. And I try to do it in a kind way through those principles.
Not yelling and screaming and judging.
Exactly, because the principles guide us to suspend judgment. I mean, I could ask a lot of questions. I wonder how we got here. I wonder how this tradition got in place. I wonder why nobody ever said anything. But to stay open. And so change is coming because of that risk I took to speak up. So now I recognize that's really the work, right?
And so what would you say to the people who say, well, why do we even need to talk about race? That all that stuff is in the past, and when we talk about race, we just bring up issues that we should be beyond talking about, and issues that we should be beyond. Why is it important in 2018 to still talk about these issues?
Because Black men are getting arrested at Starbucks. Because it's the reality of the community that we're in. When you go into a store and somebody sees your skin color and they look at you more than the other person that doesn't, because it's something that continues to affect us on a daily basis, some more than others, but it's still reality in 2018. It'd be great to wake up and not have to have these conversations and not have to have institutes and, do that type of work. But the reality is that there's people that are still hurting. And until we validate people's hurt, we're not going to get anywhere as a society.
And to those who say talking about it just brings back hard feelings, and that's not a good thing, you would say?
No, we've been working recently. There's a local task force. Valencia has been very involved with this Equal Justice Initiative. It's the Orange County Task Force. So it's looking at the history of racial terror in our community, okay? Specifically the Ocoee Massacre,
Right.
Which happened in 1920. And what I've noticed and discovered, it's no great discovery of mine. Plenty of people know this, but it has to do with trauma. That there is a level of silence, not only in the white community, but there's a level of silence in the Black community. Because so many people that I've talked to people that have grown up here their whole life. A young Black man I was talking to, I think he's probably in his mid-30s or 40s. And I said, do you know about the history of Ocoee? I mean, he grew up right here in Central Florida. He said, no, I don't know the details. I was always told not to be in Ocoee at night, but I don't know the details. I'm shocked because why are we hiding the details? And we know because of trauma that communities don't talk. Exactly. This comes out of the Holocaust survivors. Many didn't tell their story. World War II veterans didn't tell their stories. But this silence, I think, is very, very dangerous because what we're now finding out, and all the research is indicating, is that it has very tangible negative health outcomes on whole communities, right?
But you're up against the whole concept of let's not talk about the pain because it is too painful.
It is pain. And
so I totally get it from his standpoint of, I was told not to, be in Ocoee at night. I was told this, I was told that. But you never, as a young Black child, sometimes you never ask why. It's just, I don't know why, but Mom and Dad always said, don't go over there because something bad happened. And then when you try to broach that conversation of what happened, it's like, oh, we don't talk about that.
Right.
And that's the problem.
But the danger of the we don't talk about it is turning into bodily disease in people because we hold all that pain inside of us and it manifests as heart disease or diabetes or, and this is what's coming out in the research about trauma and the negative health outcomes of racism and the racism in our society. So I'm just such a big advocate of let's talk about it because wholly for all of us, and as a member of the white community, I can't imagine that living in this way is benefiting the white community. And it's certainly not benefiting the communities of color to hide the truth from each other.
So we talked about how to talk about race, which is a conversation we could have for the next year. So Rudy, as a Black man, how do we not talk about race? When someone steps to you with something, you're like, oh, yeah, that's not what you need to be saying.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole lot of making sure that the shame that's involved and the embarrassment that is involved in highlighting the racist ideas, actions, or beliefs that a person has, when that's brought to light by way of some sort of comment that might be considered a microaggression or a comment that might be just flat out explicit racism, there is this knee-jerk reaction, at least I know that I have, to say, let me call you out on this right now. But I don't know what calling somebody out on it right then and there does to bring that person back into the space because of the embarrassment. So I think about it like I do with my children, right? So when my children make a mistake, the ideal that I'm going to scream at them or correct them firmly in a space where they might be embarrassed is one that I know as an old school parent, my mother used to say, if you get in this store and you do something, I will embarrass you in the place that you stand. And just the mere,
I like that.
just the mere notion of being embarrassed like that made me just act differently in the space. Now, my mother would say that I behaved. Really what it was is that I went to this inward self of shame and guilt that I felt like my mother didn't trust me. It certainly wasn't the kind of behavior that I know was now mature for me now, right? So I understand that as a more mature parent who has the ability to look at research and the trauma that comes along with embarrassment and shame, that I can take that same kind of approach when it comes to how people have conversations about race. Now, once the safe space is created, right? So I have been known as a peace and justice facilitator to, once the safe space has been created, to call people out on certain things that I hear, but still using the principles to the best of my ability. And there have been times where I've gotten up out of a circle and just simply said, this is ridiculous. I'm out of here. Every single person here is racist. I'm done with you. And I got up and walked out. And so there are bumps along the road. There are times where I wish that I can say that, I always held my composure and that I was concerned about the embarrassment and shame. But racism runs so deep. There's this certain kind of a trigger that I know is within me that as soon as somebody does something, says something, looks at me a particular way, I am so on guard to what that does to me that I have to be mindful of my behavior. So that's where mindfulness comes into play. That's where we have the kind of cognitive ability to say, here's what's happening inside of me. I'm getting this rise. I'm getting this reaction. Rudy, there are a few ways that you can respond to this in the moment, and which one would be much more productive. Now, that comes from years, right, of acknowledging what's happening on the inside of me and how I have certain amounts of control over that. But outside of that, I'm not sure. I don't ever call out anyone when I see them going off on somebody because of the way that they have been placed in this situation of being now the one who bears the brunt of racism. If I see them going off, I can totally understand that. And it would be less of me to now go and correct that person. That's not how we do this as Black people. We're not getting anywhere. But I will say that a lot of times we talk about racism as if Black people are the only ones that are bearing the brunt of what that means. I mean, the kind of shame that goes with the kind of white guilt that I've seen, the kind of shame that white people have in having conversations about race and shutting down completely because they just feel like they're always going to be perceived as the bad person.
And they don't want to offend anyone.
Yes.
Because they're afraid of what they say and how they say it.
And then there's this other component of just simple, I'm a spiritual man, right? And so when I have conversations with people about physical, like what's happening in our physical world, there's a certain kind of spiritual depravity and bankruptcy that is present when a person doesn't feel or see or connect with somebody else's spirit, right? So there's this energy that's off. And I think a lot of times there's an acknowledgement that this kind of spiritual depravity, this kind of energy that is now present in the space that seems like it's coming from a white person who feels guilty is something that isn't really, it isn't talked about that often because we keep it to, I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything, and now that's it. But there still seems like there's this weight that is often not discussed that goes outside of the physical responses that people have that I think should be given more attention to.
So I read something the other day that said the one thing that you do not say in a racial conversation is ask that person to be a spokesman or spokeswoman for all people of their race. Like, ask me a question like, why do all Black people? Well, I don't know all Black people. Maybe that comes as a shock to you. And I don't think I'm a spokesman for all. I mean, maybe I am. Maybe I just need to embrace the fact that I am a spokesman for all Black women in America. But I'm not.
Probably not.
So I can tell you from my perspective, but I can't say, because all Black people don't think alike, contrary to popular belief. Marucci?
Yeah, that's interesting because when I was talking to the girl today at the tutoring, she was telling me, I was asking her, we got in the conversations of Black Lives Matter and talking about police brutality, and it was interesting because she said that she doesn't support the Black Lives Matters movement. And shame on me for just assuming that she did. That one's on me. But then I was looking at her, and the more that she was talking about it, because I wanted to know, and I kind of wanted to get that out of her from her perspective, and she said, because people always say that Black people are angry. And then we have these protests, and then people riot, and they burn a police car. So you just told white people that we're exactly what they're telling us we are, and we're saying we're not. So for her, to see it from her perspective, it was so interesting to kind of see how, as we have children that are aging in our community, right, as they're getting older, that they're taking all this in and they're looking at adults trying to look for guidance, and we probably don't do ourselves any justice. And I see it within my own community that there's times that I go, oh, did they really just do that? Or did they say that because for better or worse, now everyone's going to think that everybody's that way. So I think it's interesting, and I think that just going back to what we were talking about earlier is just listening and hearing people's perspective, but not automatically ending a conversation when they don't agree with you, right? So I can just imagine her at her family's house, and she says that she doesn't believe in the Black Lives Matters movement. I can imagine that they open the door and say, why don't you say, or you just don't know, or when you get older, you'll understand. Instead of maybe validating how she feels and saying, okay, so how would you change it? What do you think we could do different? What would you like to see done differently?
Listening and talking.
Yeah. So I just, just kind of listening to all that, and it was a really interesting conversation with her, because I think that we just kind of assumed that, right? So it's, well, obviously you have to agree because, well, no, maybe I don't. And maybe there's another way to look at something. And maybe all the adults are just completely wrong, and we have to start looking somewhere else to kind of find that solution.
Okay, so let's move now, because we can come back to this conversation
Forever.
Many, many times. But and so there's not, wrapping it up in a bow. We can't. But I think we start by what we're doing here today, which is talking and just agreeing to listen without judging people and without yelling. And that without yelling part is for me personally, because I like to yell when I'm having these conversations. I'm trying to get better. So let's talk about something that you mentioned, which is the incident. If you could see me, my air quotes, the incident at Starbucks. When you first heard that, tell me your initial feeling, your initial thought.
I go to Starbucks all the time. I'm so upset because I can't tell you how many times I've held a meeting at Starbucks and I've sat in a seat for half an hour, for 45 minutes because someone's late, and no one so much looked at me twice. It is so frustrating. And to have people, and it was interesting because even in the conversation earlier, she told me, she's like, you know what? Well, growing up, my parents just said that if somebody tells you to leave somewhere, you just leave to avoid issues. And I told her, I'm like, I can respect that, but why are we at that point as a society that because of your skin color, you just have to automatically leave somewhere that you're at and that you can be at? To me, that is just mind-boggling that in 2018 we're still there.
Rachel?
Well, yeah, this is a tough one. I mean,
well, yeah.
But I think we know that this is happening. I mean, it's happening everywhere. I'm in an interracial family. My husband is Black. My children are biracial, and so I've learned things over the last 10 years being with Willie when he says, Rachel, that's just not something I can do. And I would never think twice about it. In the time we were on our honeymoon in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and those neon nail polish colors had just come out. Well, they were popular down there. There were a lot of them, and I had never seen them before. And I walked in and started testing them on my fingernails. And he said to me, Rachel, my sister could never do that, just so you know. That's your white privilege. And this was years ago when I was just waking up to being white, honestly. I'm white and it matters. And so the more I've been able to really look at the racism, and I remember the first time I said out loud, I'm racist, I felt like I could be sick, like sick.
You said that about yourself. You said, I'm racist.
I did. I had to. Because I'm 21 years sober in a 12-step program, right? And in order to get through alcoholism or drug addiction, you have to say, I admit I'm an alcoholic. And I will tell you that is the hardest thing to do because, alcoholics sleep under bridges and they're horrible people and they lie and they cheat and they steal. And so to admit it, But so to admit to being racist, having internalized racism, the image we have is wears the hood and is, and yet I knew that if I was going to get, I married a Black man and I had 2 biracial children and I'd worked a long time on self-honesty, right?
And based on that, most people would not think you were racist.
Yeah, but I had to be honest with myself because what are the thoughts that go through my mind, right? What do I think about when I see a Black man walk by? I remember years ago, I'm married to a black man. I mean, I'm being honest with you, right? But I remember being in a room like this where there was like a window and seeing a black man walk by and feeling afraid. But in that mindfulness that Rudy was talking about, being aware, like, I just got afraid seeing a black man walk by that window, and I'm married to a black man. It's in me. It's internalized. And so I had to, I was desperate. I want to get better, right? I want to heal from this disease we have in our society. Beverly Tatum called it smog. We all breathe it. We breathe it in and we breathe it out. So I know I'm not a bad person. And I felt that if I admit it, that I have a better chance of getting to the other side, just like how I'm 21 years sober, because I was willing to admit it. So it's an important step, and it's so painful, to do that.
Yeah, so I'll hear my white friends say, Rudy, there's no way I could be racist, right? And then they'll look for me to validate what they're hoping is not a reality. Well, I was raised by my mother. My father passed away when I was young. I have 4 sisters. That doesn't make me any less sexist, right? I mean, saying that I'm married to a black man, or saying that my wife who's biracial, like saying that, like, because I know how to breathe in sexism. I know how to look at a woman and say to a woman, in my head, I'm saying there's no way that she is a leader. There's no way that, like, I can imagine her leading. That is a thought that I have to come to grips with and go, where does that come from? What are my actions saying about that? How am I articulating that in subtle ways that do damage to me? And it shouldn't take my having daughters and hoping that they're not sexually assaulted for me to wake up as a man and go, that's not how I should be. I should value women. Well, if we think about that in the context of racism, it's amazing how many white people say things like, I adopted black kids. My best friend was black growing up. Rudy, you've been my friend for 10 years. And all of the evidence that they would submit and yield to say, and that's why systemic racism, that's in healthcare, education, criminal justice, none of that impacted how I view you, right? None of that impacted how I view black people. And there's something to be said about knowing that as a man, I have internalized sexist behaviors and attitudes, and I need to be able to own that and work from that space. But the moment that I ask a white person to own racism, to own the way in which they've internalized racism, and whether it comes out subtly or whether it comes out explicitly, that's a pretty damning affirmation or confirmation that you're laying on a white person. And so they will reject, or many that have been in my circle will reject that right out and say, like, if I think, Rudy, if you think I'm racist, then why are we friends? As if that's the benchmark for acknowledging whether or not their racism exists inside of them. So I just think that that's something that we might want to be mindful of.
And so there's like 1,000 gems in there. So based on all of that, when you, as a black man, saw the Starbucks story.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's what I was like. What you said was great. Getting back to my question.
So this is good. So when I saw the story, there was nothing there that surprised me. I didn't go, oh, it's 2018 and this is still happening. I just moved to Lake County, and I wake up in the morning at 5 o'clock to go running. My biggest fear is that a neighbor is going to come outside and see me running and call the police because I've been pulled over at 4:30 in the morning running in Altamont Springs, where I was told to sit on the curb and just wait until they can verify that I have a wallet that's back at the house that has my ID of where I live. I mean, these things happen, and my fear, my wife has a fear that is justified. And there's a certain amount of fear that I carry while I'm running to de-stress about, like, what kind of society we live in. So when the Starbucks, people who know me know also, I go to Starbucks 5 days a week. I have a budget line that says how much I can spend at Starbucks in a week. So this was no surprise to me. This was classic. When I walk into Starbucks, my barista knows my name. Hey, Rudy, how you doing? And yet I wonder if they didn't know me, the degree to which, if I were just to be hanging around and I'm not dressed in the bow tie and a professor garb, I wonder what that, because I've seen the responses to other people who they don't know. So it's not Starbucks though, right? Like this is, colleges, universities. This is so it's not a surprise. This is neighborhoods. This is,
But what concerned me, and the reason I told the story about, my own internalized the racism, is because I heard one of the leaders in reading, they're going to take the day to do the workshop. And I think it's great. I think there's been a quick and swift response. There's been an ownership. And I got concerned when one of their leaders, it was, I believe, a general counsel, I don't know the person's name, said, well, but really, most of our employees don't really need this. This doesn't apply to most of them. And then I became very concerned, because to have a leader see that, when in fact, what we know is all the research tells us that this implicit bias is in all of us, and especially around racism. So to suggest that the majority of Starbucks employees don't really need this training is problematic.
And a lot of people see that day, though, this racial bias training day, kind of see that as window dressing. Like, we're not going to unracist you, which is a made-up term that I just made up. We're not going to unracist you in a day. So what's the point?
Well, I think it's good that they've taken an action and to acknowledge it. And I think we all need to be doing it. We all need to be doing more learning, more education. One day is not going to take care of much of anything. It is an acknowledgement that we have a problem. And again, that's the admitting. That's the first step. What are the next steps? I mean, that is definitely the question. But we can look at all of our industries, all of our institutions. We all have this. And so what steps are we individually in our own institutions going to take? This is not going to happen with one-day diversity and inclusion trainings at large corporations. It's going to have to be systemic change within all of these areas.
So how about the boycott, the Starbucks boycott? Rudy, since you go there 5 days a week.
Are you getting rid of your line item?
I could boycott my institution. I could boycott the church. If I had to boycott every institution that's been racist, that has racist people. It's not an institution, right? The institution is made up by people. And if those people reflect what the census tells us about who we are racially, I bet that there are a significant number of individuals at that place, no matter what the institution is, that holds on to racist ideology and beliefs. And so I got tired of boycotting. I just got tired of saying I'm not watching an NFL game, and I'm not. And when I go to church, you know what? I'm done with this church. And then now I go to my job, and I'm done with being the only black person that teaches in a division. Yeah, I could keep going down the list and saying how I'm done and I'm tired, but removing myself from every single situation that involves racism will be like me removing myself from the world. And I mean the world. I don't mean like the United States. Anti-blackness is a real thing in the world. So I would have to move to a whole planet and say, no racism exists here.
The boycott, Marucci?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that, I don't know.
And I love coffee, too.
And he just has a whole line item. I'm going to take that away from today. I think, I don't know. And maybe it's cliche, but I think that if we talk things out, right, if we continue to learn, education really is the root of everything. And I was presenting at an event last week. We were talking about payday lending, totally unrelated, but kind of related because it's minority communities that are affected the most. And they're like, well, how do you fix it? I'm like, education. I know that sounds so cliche, but we can't give up and we can't stop the conversation. I think when people wake up that day and they go get their coffee and they can't, that continues the conversation. Some people are going to be upset. Other people will be posting on Facebook that they're excited about it. So it just continues a conversation. So if nothing else, yeah, it is only the employees of Starbucks. But literally, that is a lot of people that are going to be affected by not having their coffee that day.
Exactly.
So it continues that conversation. It gives people an outlet that maybe you're really upset about it. But are you really upset about the coffee? Like, are you not more upset that 2 black men were arrested out of Starbucks for sitting? Right? So having those conversations with your friends, having that conversation at work, as uncomfortable as it is, it's going to cause people to have to talk about it because we just kind of can't keep going through life being like, oh, it just happened again, and that's okay.
All right, so let's take a break. and we'll come back and talk about our video of the week or day. But when we're talking about the Starbucks thing, I just wanted to mention that I saw a sign after the police chief finally came forward and, said, hey, maybe this wasn't done correctly. And we heard from the CEO and the chairman of the board. And the sign for one of the protesters said, too little, too latte. We'll be right back. Thank you all for listening to Colorblind, Race Across Generations. We have two groups that are represented today in the podcast. You'll hear us talk about the Peace and Justice Institute. That is at Valencia College here in Orlando. The goal is just to create, as they call it, to create a space. So this institute is all about issues of diversity and inclusion, nonviolence, but really getting people to talk about race. How do we open up that dialogue? And also Latino Leadership, which is a nonprofit organization. The goal of it's been around for several years. The goal is really to help people who move into Central Florida, to help them transition into a society here, to be involved, to cultivate leadership, to work on voter registration, all of those important issues. So we have an expert panel with us today. Welcome back, Podcast Village. So during these segments, we have a video or a picture of the week. So all of you have seen the video from the fraternity at Syracuse University, Theta Tau. 18 members of the fraternity, because of this video that was racist and sexist and everything you can mention, homophobic, everything. 18 members were removed from class, and they're being taught in a separate area. The fraternity itself was expelled, and now the students have been, they're facing some disciplinary action. So we don't know what that is going to be at this point of this taping today. When you saw the video, what were you thinking? These are students probably from the ages of maybe 18 to 22, a younger generation. When you saw the video, what were your thoughts, Marucci?
I actually didn't see the video. I read the article. I don't like to watch things. I don't watch TV. We don't have a TV at the house. Well, we have a TV, but it's only on for sports and the NFL every now and then. But I don't like it. I don't like to kind of keep being fed what I'm supposed to think, so I keep it off. But I read the article so that we can talk about it today. And one of the things that was most alarming to me wasn't that still happens. It was, I think, towards the end of the article, it was talking about, even though this happened at the university and the protests were majority minorities that were protesting it, but the school's predominantly white. So there was still that void of somebody outside of the people they were talking about standing up for it. And that, I think, was, to me, the most disturbing part, right? Because, unfortunately, you kind of become numb to these occurrences because they happen so often, and you just keep getting and you're inundated by it. And, like, what do you do? How do you react? You can't fix it all. But then you can get upset about things like that if you see that this is occurring, like, why aren't their fellow students the first ones on the front line saying that is not right? And we support that 100%. Because it just kind of goes back to, and that was the quote of the apathy, that we just kind of stay quiet and go, okay, well, it's not me. It doesn't really affect me, and if it doesn't affect my daughter, it doesn't affect my husband, I'm not going to worry about it. So I think that, for me, that was the most frustrating part, and it's just crazy. Like I was reading the stuff that they were saying, and I was thinking, because my husband sometimes jokes that, he doesn't joke, he really means it, but he says that every time an older person dies, the world becomes a little bit better. And the first time he said it, I kind of just stopped and looked at him. I'm like, why would you say that? That's horrible. And he's like, no, a little bit more prejudice dies, a little bit more unwillingness to kind of accept the community as we are dies. And someone younger is coming up. And then I see that and I go, but no, we're supposed to have hope for the younger generation. And then you see that. Why hasn't that changed? Why is the needle not moving? Is it just now this resurgence of hate? Like, what? I can't wrap my brain around it.
A lot of people, there was an athlete, and I can't remember which one, so I shouldn't say the name just in case. Like, I think it might be, who said the same thing, who said, in order to solve racism, we need all these old people to die off.
Sounds like Charles Barkley.
And, I'll have to research. But that's
Sounds like something he would say.
That's what the person said. And so, but that's not the case.
Yeah.
Clearly,
No,
we're
it's
seeing
not.
that.
Yeah.
So, Rachel, when you saw it, what were your thoughts?
I found it to be incredibly disturbing, and I don't know what's happening to me right now. I've had some disturbing things happen in the last week. Really, they're kind of adding up. Having taken a trip to Savannah and going to a tourist site that's a fort there that they're flying the Confederate flag, and seeing a juvenile detention center last week where everybody behind that fence had a very dark brown skin. Every one of the bodies there was a dark brown male. I mean, just things like this. And then watching that video, seeing the march over the weekend, it's so deeply disturbing. And I think as parents, I mean, I have a friend who announced that her son was going to join a fraternity. And I think really we need to step back and really think about what we are doing. And not to offend anyone, but folks, what have these fraternities and sororities been about in the last 100 years? And let's be honest with ourselves. The sexism, the racism built in, and we tell ourselves these lies that they do good service work, but let's be real, folks. And so what I felt was promising was that the president of the college announced in video that it was a permanent expulsion from the university, because what happens with
the fraternity.
Of the fraternity, because what happens with these fraternities is there's a temporary shutdown, and 2 to 3 years later they're back on campus, and that's about economics.
When the tension is gone.
But so I must say, coming off of the Starbucks response, which we may feel that a day of training is inadequate, which it is, and yet it was swift. And I remember hearing that COO and the CEO say, we did this, it happened, we're responsible, we're taking responsibility. And I felt that that's what I heard that university president say. This is a permanent expulsion. And I was, that's something. It is something. And the fact that they are, they're investigating these individuals, I think we've got to take this thing seriously. And because these are our children's lives that are being impacted. And the parents that saw their children behaving that way,
Yeah,
what do they feel? And you know what? Let's talk about it. Let's get those parents together and have a conversation, because my goodness, it's not okay.
Rudy, when you saw it, your thoughts?
I was reminded of a history professor who said that nearly, I think the number is close, somewhere between 600,000 to 700,000 people, Americans, died in the Civil War. More than all of the wars that America's ever been in, died. And they died so that one group could own my body. Right? I mean, our nation was nearly split apart so that people could own my body. And 3 or 4 or 5 generations later, I teach at a college where students say to me every single time, "Oh, Mr. Darden, I think that might be something that's in other generations. That's not in my generation." Until they say something, or until somebody says something that allows me to see, I know why so many people died. It's got to be really bad for a white person to kill another white person to own my body. And for it to be 600,000 white people and about 40,000 black people, at the time the numbers go up and down in terms of what was counted as a body and what wasn't. For all of these people to die so that one group could own my body, I know why there's still vestiges of it. I know why fraternities still behind closed doors highlight that this is who we are, and we're going to celebrate that. because it gives them prominence and power. They get to say that they own our body, that we're superior. And that video was just another indication of our deep history and how we fail to acknowledge it and fail to realize it. And so you have a generation that thinks it's okay to quote unquote play like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
We're just joking.
Because they
we're
said,
just
yeah, they
joking.
said it was
Yeah.
just
We're just being
satire. It was just a
boys.
joke. Yeah.
But if they knew that joke was tied to 600,000 of their own ancestors, white people killing white people to own black people, if they knew that those kind of jokes led to the costliest war, the deadliest American war ever, I don't know if they would be joking like that today, if they knew that their ancestors died because of it. And because we romanticize the Civil War, we don't really talk about what it really means to say to somebody, hey, I'll kill the most amount of Americans that we've ever seen killed in all wars combined just so that we can own black people's bodies. That is, if we had that kind of conversation and narrative and taught that kind of subject matter, maybe there would be some kind of acknowledgement in today's generation and in today's youth just how serious and significant this is, in the same way that Germany teaches I lived 3 years in Germany. So I know what it's like to live in a space where they take it very seriously, their history, and they teach it, and it's taught, and we talk about the ramifications. And I just thought, oh, it's over with. But no, when I went to Germany, it was very clear that everyone is going to get some teachings from the time that they're 3 or 4 years old, right up until they're in university, to make sure that they understand how costly this history that they have has been for Germany. America, we just haven't done that yet, and we keep seeing this, and then we say we're surprised.
So as we end today, you guys this has been a great conversation for us. We always end with completing this sentence. When it comes to race, I admit. Rudy?
First thought, frustrated. I admit I'm frustrated, but I also admit that the frustration comes from my understanding how much I'm a part of systems of oppression that keep us where we are. So I admit that I'm frustrated, and a part of it is because I'm frustrated with myself.
Rachel?
I admit that I still have work to do to keep waking up to what it means to be white, and to having an understanding of, my fellow human beings.
Marucci?
Let's see. I was thinking about this on the way here. I would admit that as a mom, it starts and ends at our home, that it's up to me to continue to have conversations that maybe with a 9-year-old we shouldn't have, that, we're not talking about Barbies and we're not talking about dolls, but we're having real conversations. And I know that not everybody always likes it, and they tell me, well, she's only 9, but she's aware and she knows, and I will always know that that's my most important responsibility.
Thank you all. Again, great conversation. Some hard to discuss topics, but that's the point of the podcast for Colorblind, Race Across Generations. Producer Keith is laughing because every time I say it, I mess up the name. The name of the podcast is Colorblind, Race Across Generations. Thank you for joining. You guys will be back, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And to you, the Podcast Village, thank you for listening as well. Thank you again for listening. This is our 3rd episode of, I'll say it right this time, Colorblind, Race Across Generations. I'm with producer Keith. We have received so many responses through text messages and on our social media pages of people telling us what they think about the podcast. Thanks for all your kind comments. Thanks for your great suggestions and ideas for segment topics. We have a favor to ask, though. We need you to subscribe.
Yeah, so the more people subscribe on iTunes, the higher up we go, and the more people listen to it, and the more our message gets out there.
And that's the whole point. So be sure to give us a wonderful rating and nice comments.
Yeah, if you have a bad comment, just keep it yourself.
That's our strategy.
Yeah, we don't need that. There's other things you could do. You don't have to listen, but
just go ahead and subscribe.
Yeah, just subscribe anyway.
And
it takes 2 seconds. That's fine.
We have a special message for those who are not iTunes subscribers. Producer Keith, tell us about that.
So we're still working, but we are working to get you guys on Spotify, Shoutcast. I have someone in the building that keeps telling me to go on Podbean because that's her special thing, and she doesn't want to think about anything. Anyway, sorry. But we are working to try to get this on as many platforms as possible. We're on episode 3, so episode 10, if we get on every single podcast platform, I think we'll be good to go. But we're good to go. We're going to try. We should have a website up pretty soon here. I'm just going to say it, and then it'll come through.
I'm like, we have a website? This is great.
We'll have billboards on I-4. But we're going to try to get a website going, so if you don't want to do the whole podcast route, you'll be able to play it on the website. So we're getting it all ready for everybody to listen to it and enjoy it.
So again, thank you for your comments, for your suggestions, and thanks for being a part of our podcast village. Colorblind, Race Across Generations.